Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 49.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and today I bring on Dr. Cratio Jug. And we talk about a recent article that had been in the news. You've seen it all over Facebook. And, a lot of people said, hey, don't bring attention to this. Don't talk about this. And, the take-home message here, guys, is that you have to fight ideas with ideas. And with all the things going on in the news and violence and, the actions that we see being taken around the world, I think it just makes sense to talk about how to create an argument that attacks an idea. And we take on this article, and I think interestingly, as usual, you'll see that we have a different spin, not because we're defeating every single argument that this person has, but in some of the cases and some of the arguments, this person's actually correct. And I know chiropractors don't want to hear that. So listen in, let us know what you think, and enjoy today's episode of Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. Cratio, welcome back to Life by Design for Chiropractors. How are you today?
I'm doing great. And as always, I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, we got a great article we're going to cover today, one that's got some press, at least hot press in the chiropractic circles. And since this is Life by Design for chiropractors, we're going to talk about that today. We're talking about an article that you probably already have seen. You've seen it talked about in different Facebook groups, and you'll know it as chiropractors are bullshit. You shouldn't trust them with any part of your spine or any other part of your body. So we do want to talk about this today. It's a scathing commentary about chiropractic, and obviously at first read, pretty much any chiropractor is going to get defensive. The author is blasting the profession, saying, as I said, it's BS. It's linked to injury, strokes, death. In fact, she calls it buffoonery.
Buffoon.
It's a pretty good word. So before we get into this, I think it's important that, of course, we could go through this, and we're not just interested in, quote unquote, debunking her arguments. I think a lot of her arguments are actually valid. So, we're going to, as we often do, take the opposite side of the river here, or the road, and talk about the fact that, some of the things she's saying are absolutely true as a large trend across the chiropractic profession. So I think we need to stop for a second, and before we get emotional, we need to be a little more rational, Cratio.
Oh, absolutely. I think the name of the game, I think human beings in general, not just the chiropractic profession and the people listening, I think human beings are, we're taught to rely on our emotions as guides for things. I think that's a horrible idea. We need to rely on our mind. We need to rely on reason. Reason is the thing that sets us apart from every other animal in the animal kingdom, right? We make decisions based on data, on science, on logic, right? That's how we know how to do things. And I think if you start listening to your emotions, it's going to be really tough. Not to say emotions are bad. Emotions are great. That's what makes life awesome to have. However, your emotions are a result from your thinking and your actions, not the cause of your thinking and your actions.
Yeah, well said. And I think that it's interesting in that we just finished at least the second draft of the Think by Design manual, Cratio, and I know you put together a really good piece of material, and we've worked on that together, and we're excited actually to launch that. And one of the things that is really coming up here is, Ayn Rand, who we've talked about on numerous times in the show, felt like there was three fundamental values for people that if you didn't have these as values, it would be impossible for you to have a successful and happy life. And one of those values was reason.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was the primary value. She would say that, and again, I know a lot of people listening probably dislike Ayn Rand. I'm not asking you to like her. I'm just asking you to listen, and to maybe rattle it around in your brain. For her, reason was the most important. Like I said, it was the thing that sets a human being apart from everybody else. You can't talk to a bear, right? You can't share your ideas with the bear and then you come to a different conclusion. The bear is impervious to reason. It's an animal. But human beings, we exist with reason. We exist with ideas. These are the controlling factors of our lives. This is what makes us a human being. And she would argue that if you accepted reason as your primary source of anything, you could logically come up with the other two reasons, which were self-esteem and productive purpose.
Correct. And, it's interesting, again, that we're seeing, we see the effects of this in the world on a regular basis. We're seeing it right now.
Every day.
As we talked about earlier in the United States with some of the stuff that's going on there. And, just people acting from emotion versus using thoughts to solve problems and using thoughts to destroy ideas that are, immoral.
Well, we don't have to talk in such a global scale. What we're going to be doing today, essentially, like the way that this article has been handled very poorly for the most part by most chiropractors. It's involved a lot of emotion, a lot of like violent tendencies and hateful comments. You have to learn how to defeat ideas with ideas, right? With words, right? If you can just squash the idea, she loses. And we win, and that's how it goes. And nobody has to get hurt, and we can honor other people's thinking in the process. That's what we're going to be doing.
Okay, so given that context for today, Horatio, why don't you start off by talking about some of the most common, or at least reviewing these, we've touched on them in the past, reviewing these common logical fallacies that we're going to see throughout this, give people the principle behind them just so people can start to think for themselves when they read other material.
Yeah, sure. So, hold me accountable because I'm probably going to forget some of them. But the ones that are the most prevalent in articles like this are an ad hominem attack. So an ad hominem attack is when you try to discredit the human being, versus the idea, right? So she mentions other chiropractors. Or sorry, I don't have to mention other chiropractors. She mentions D.D. Palmer and how chiropractic was born out of a seance and how he was a quack. Well, that doesn't discredit his idea, right? When we recorded a similar podcast, I brought up the idea of that's like debunking Volkswagen because it was created by Hitler, right? It doesn't negate the whole idea or the quality of the product just because the person was a weirdo. So that's number one, ad hominem. The other one is a straw man. This is when you would say something like, well, chiropractors are anti-vaccine and they don't believe in the germ theory, which has nothing to do with the practice of the chiropractic profession. But because you're bringing up, fringe ideas that a lot of people would disagree with, and you're positioning them in the way that they sound crazy, now you're trying to use the leverage that you've created there to say, well, these ideas are crazy, and clearly chiropractic is crazy. The other one is cherry picking, right? So when we get to the section of there's no data to support chiropractic. No, there's data to support chiropractic. She just chooses to cherry pick certain data and then avoid other data because for whatever reason it doesn't suit her agenda, right? Like probably the most famous scientific study that got cherry picked was Ansel Keys' 21 country study, which became the 7 country study, right? He just dropped 14 countries and away we go. The other one, what other one did we talk about?
Appeal to authority, Horatio.
Appeal to authority. Well, I talked to doctors, and they think that chiropractic is bullshit, so chiropractic's got to be bullshit. I don't give a crap what doctors say or what anyone in authority says. I want to know the facts. I want to know the data, right? Just because some authority said it doesn't make it true, right? It's that 50 million Frenchmen comment, right? Well, 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. Well, absolutely, they could all be wrong, every single one of them. And one poor lonely beggar could be right? True is true. It's absolute. It's outside of our realm. Like it's outside of the realm of like emotions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really the point of today and going through this. And we're going to spend a few minutes going through some of the arguments that she gives. And, we're going to give credit where credit is due or acknowledge, what arguments are correct. We'll break down which arguments aren't so you, as the doctor, can understand this. This isn't something, obviously, you're going to be sharing with practice members. This is something that you need to understand for yourself, not so much for this article, but because these are just simply repeated mantras in the discreditation of chiropractic for the last 100 years. Right? This is not something new. So, I think having an understanding is going to be valuable, Horatio.
Yeah, let me just interject. This is one of those things, right? So we should have talked about this at the beginning, but here's why this is important for you. If you don't understand this, if your response is just some emotional garbage to have an emotional release, this article and this type of thinking will get into your mind and it will ruin your ability to practice and become an excellent chiropractor and doctor. You have to, for yourself, not for me or Jamie or Life by Design, but for yourself and the people who you want to take care of, you have to learn how to thoroughly defeat these ideas in your mind or they will fester in there, and they will take your certainty away. They will take your self-esteem away, and they will hurt you and your practice.
So true. So true. So here's a question for you, Horatio. Maybe you can comment. In a case like this, do the author's credentials matter?
No, absolutely not. That would be an appeal to authority, right? We have to look at the claims being made, and we have to look at the ideas being put forth.
So what you're saying is if someone with zero expertise was still able to discern the truth is the truth, regardless of whether they're, say, an expert in the spine or the heart or whatever other body part we'd be talking about.
The truth is the truth, right? Look at Denise Minger completely crushed the China study, and she's a journalist, right? And her level of understanding research was phenomenal, and she brought up excellent points. No, it doesn't matter who's writing. We have to drop all these ideas. It matters what's being said. Right.
So, another component of the context here before we get into some of these interesting arguments is, I think, just the idea of science itself, and I guess this goes back to cherry picking, but, always saying, well, there's no evidence. And, I guess you ask the question, what counts as evidence? To say there's no evidence for, say, chiropractic, or there's no evidence for something else. Once you say there's no evidence, you're making a pretty bold claim. None, zero is a pretty extreme. I would almost make the claim, Horatio, there's almost a fractional amount of evidence for almost everything probably on the planet.
Well, yes, I totally agree. Again, but it brings up more interesting questions, right? There's no evidence. Evidence, just saying the term, there's no evidence. It's a context drop. Evidence for what? Right? So what's the goal that's being discussed? What are we trying to do? And if you don't clarify those terms, and very few people ever clarify their terms when they say words like that, it kind of leaves everything to be open-ended, right? So, you have to really define your terminology, right? There's no evidence for chiropractic. There's no evidence that chiropractors exist. There's no evidence that chiropractors can help people. There's no evidence for what? I'm not really sure what that claim means.
Right. So let's talk about some of these arguments, because I think some of them are true. Some of them are absolutely untrue. And again, let's go through the thinking to help you guys who are listening in. How would you go through this thought process and discern what is true, isn't true? And as Horatio said so well, is create space in your mind to continue to be a successful doctor and chiropractor and not let this stuff get in there and fester. So one of the arguments she makes is, who peddles real medicine out of a kiosk?
Right. So, this is something that we've talked about. I just think first of all, I don't think it looks great. I think it looks bad on the profession when we're doing things that the public, would discern as unprofessional. But again, it doesn't negate the fact that the product is of high quality.
Well, even if you look at how medicine is being marketed now, it's very different than it was 20 years ago. Plenty of hospitals and individual doctors market their services. There's social media, there's the branding of their hospitals and individual services. There's community outreach programs where, sure, maybe they don't stand at a kiosk, but they go into a school and educate kids in a school about what it is they do. And, is that doctorly? I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean? Is that something that, beseeches being a doctor of some sort? Well, again, what the public accepts is changing. And I think there's ways to communicate your message to the public and ways to be professional. I think being professional is really the key here. So I think that's the take-home point. But again, the argument is a false argument in that where you communicate truth has no bearing on whether what you're communicating is true or not.
Absolutely. And again, it's context dropping. You're dropping the context of the individual that's there. And the problem with articles like this is it lumps, we're getting into this idea of chiropractors. Well, there's no such thing as a chiropractors group. There's chiropractors, individuals, right? So every chiropractor has different beliefs and a different belief system, and they market their practice differently. And so, you have to take all those things into context when you're looking at stuff like this.
Again, that's the logical fallacy is, looking at a generalization across the profession and then making that out to be how everybody in the profession is. So just because a large group of chiropractors maybe do talk about vaccination in their practice and, encouraging people not to get vaccinated, doesn't mean all chiropractors do that. It doesn't make it part of chiropractic. In fact, sad to say, not even addressing the spine makes that included in all chiropractic practices.
We'll get to, I think she brings up really valid arguments about subluxation and the definition of some of these things, and I think that's a legit problem in the profession, but we'll get to that.
Again, similar line of thinking here, just, again, cherry picking and making a claim and then applying it across the board, but something like, she'll say, well, the adrenal gland isn't in the spine, so how could a chiropractor have anything to do with the adrenal gland? So because of that, chiropractors talking about adrenal function are crazy and, that invalidates the entire profession. The point is, I'm not sure what that has to do with disproving chiropractic, but where she is correct is that anytime you claim to fix, cure, or treat a condition, I think you open yourself up to questioning, right, in a way that is different than when you position yourself as, is there a relationship between the spine and the neurological system? Seems to be. Is there a relationship between spinal motion and motion in general and stress? Seems to be. Could the adrenal gland be involved in the body's stress response? I'm pretty sure it is. So should we claim to take pressure off the nerves to the adrenal gland? Probably not. But what we can talk about is improving motion, improving function, improving neurology, and having an effect on the overall function of the body there. And sure, by side effect or through a relationship, it may affect the adrenal gland. But I'll tell you, every single person that I make a correction to in their lumbar spine doesn't have an improvement in adrenal function, right? So, the body's not wired up in the way we're often communicating. So I think this is where she's correct. And I honestly think she doesn't even know that she's correct in making this statement. But she is correct in the sense that, yes, which is the funny part, right, when you think about it. Yes, she is correct in the sense that, we do claim as a large fraction of the profession to cure, treat, and fix conditions and relate them to the spine. That's paradigm 2. Mrs. Jones, I know the cause of your problem. It's subluxation. And if we can correct the subluxation, take pressure off these nerves, this other problem is going to go away. Of course, that's not correct.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that statement right there, an equivalent statement, that is being tried to pass for certainty in chiropractic. Mm-hmm. You don't need to say that to appear certain to the person across from the table. All you have to do is actually be certain, and whatever you say, you'll be certain in it. Like there's been lots of, even saying the stuff that you're unsure about. I'm not sure about this. That's enough for people. Like you don't have to say false claims to try to appear certain. Because I think that's an issue. I think that's an issue with some of the stuff. I think people think, well, I have to tell them I'm going to get them well or they're never going to come into my practice. I just don't think that's not my experience, is all I'm saying.
It's not my experience at all. In fact, if anything, I would say it is a negative communication piece in terms of building strong agreements and long-term retention. You're setting yourself up for massive failure because you're connecting what you're doing to a specific condition that you have no control over. Versus, it's like somebody comes to train in our gym and I say, listen, I'm going to put you through a training system that's going to be great. It's going to address the requirements of your body and there'll be positive outcomes. I just don't know what they all are. I just know that you're going to be better off if we can restore motion to your body, develop strength, and condition your body better. I can guarantee those 3 things will happen. But beyond that, I don't know what the outcomes are. Although, that said, it would make sense that there would be a relationship to X, Y, and Z through this mechanism. And people, they understand that concept. And when it doesn't happen, so when somebody trains and they say, you know what, I didn't lose 20 pounds, but man, I feel a whole lot better and I'm moving better and I'm stronger, they're still on board and they understand that, 1, there's other things they need to do, and 2, that you never claimed in the first place that was going to happen.
Right, and here's the frustrating part is people will hear the words coming out of your mouth, and they think that if they remember those words in that particular order, like it's some type of incantation, that's going to magically convince the person to do something, right, in a manipulative sort of way. But the most important part of what you just said is the certainty is you as a human being behind that statement.
Sure. Yes. I mean, it's a whole other podcast about self-esteem and certainty and the components.
Or a whole conference.
Yes, or a whole conference. Exactly. I know we're in the middle of creating the content for LifeCon coming up and talking about the ultimate chiropractic sales process, mindset, playbook, and application. And, the whole first part is, really the mindset that it takes to guide people through a sales process. And that's one of the big pieces of it. One of the other arguments she makes, which I have a chuckle every time I read through this, but
I think they're hilarious, some of them.
But claiming that most areas of medicine or other areas of medicine have evolved through hypothesis, experimentation, and peer review. On the other hand, chiropractic was birthed through hocus pocus and guesswork and strongly held religious beliefs. But again, what's the facts? And I'm not saying some of this didn't exist, but some of this also existed in medicine. So if you're going to compare the two.
I think she is, right? I think she's saying back in 1895, everything was kind of crazy, but then medicine took this one path and chiropractic stayed on this voodoo.
Right. Although, again, if you look at BJ, as we talked about in the pre-show, BJ was extremely scientific. And, science was a large part of his process, measured everything, looked at all the different variables. He really wanted to scientifically understand what was happening with the spine and its relationship to the body. So, it's almost as if the research in the article was minimal. You know what I'm saying? It was almost as if she had these ideas, kind of lumped them together, researched a few things to support the components she needed to support, whether it was through a Google search to find the things that she needed to say to back up her concepts, versus actually doing a very legitimate research review, in-depth understanding of the concepts, which again, as a journalist, I would just consider that irresponsible.
Well, I mean, this is a clear example. I mean, the parts of, and I'm not going to, I don't have to pull any punches. The parts of BJ that I completely dislike are the mystical parts, and there are lots of mystical parts. The parts that I love, are the fact that he measured everything, how long people would lay, what side they would lay on after he adjusted them, what parts are moving, what's the x-rays look like, the time of the day that they got checked. He tried to quantify the whole gamut. It's convenient for her how she missed those parts, right?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm getting at is
that's the fallacy of cherry picking.
Right. But whether she missed them, Cracio, whether she missed them or she just didn't know about them. Right. So her research as a journalist didn't include uncovering those things because maybe she wasn't looking for those things.
I think just based on the amount of cherry picking, I'm just going to have to say that she totally, I think there's some things she probably read where she was like, oh, this might sound interesting. I don't think she respects her audience enough to include them. I actually kind of find it insulting, to be honest.
Well, and the last piece let's talk about is, talking about the concept of subluxation and, discrediting subluxation. This is where, some of this, in fact, the bulk of it, I probably agree with in the sense that, we still have a hard time or have not operationally defined subluxation. It's different across, different providers. Some chiropractors will claim that's a good thing. I'll claim that's a bad thing. And, again, basing the whole profession on subluxation analysis and correction, brings up a really good point that, because we haven't documented that and clarified that now this is where, of course, I think that her take-home point is incorrect, that somehow the profession shouldn't exist and that somehow the profession is an invalid profession. And that's not entirely true. Obviously, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So again, that's a big context drop, right? Because there's been times in the past where things have been happening. I mean, look at, I just read Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, and he talks about the development of the discovery of leukemia, for example, right? So these kids were having this illness, all these bad things were happening, and they would try to do things that were a miserable failure. But the fact that they kept on with it was how, whether you agree or disagree with what's happening with leukemia is not the point. The fact is that they followed the scientific method until they came up with a way to identify this and an action plan. And it just so happens that we're still in the middle of that. We don't have the chiropractic profession. Number one, we just don't have the means yet, but we're on the path, right? We know that something positive happens when we're making these checkups and corrections, which are across the board, but we just don't quite understand how to what am I looking at? To have a standardized process or how we're going to come up with it. Doesn't make it invalid.
Correct. Yes, and I think that's the take-home point here. Is she brings up very valid points, and I think as a profession we need to look at those things and work towards fixing those things and correcting those invalid points and operationally defining subluxation, having better analysis tools, understanding the epidemiology of subluxation. What is it really doing? What's the physiological effect? What happens when we deliver a force to the spine? How do we measure outcomes? Yes, and yes. But it doesn't mean that the profession doesn't exist. It means that we have to be on this journey and be relentlessly pursuing these things, which unfortunately, as a profession, we're not. And there's lots of different reasons that we're not, and whether it's, financial ability to do that, enough people in the profession to do that. We have some good people who are putting together research. Again, come back to Heidi Habit doing good work with her lab and looking at, the effects on spinal correction to brain function or neurological effects. So again, we know something's going on. We know generally something positive is happening when we move a part of the spine that isn't moving. Those things we know. And, I feel certain that over time, we're going to continue to move down that path. I think we can do it better. I think we can do it faster. Again, outside the scope of today's conversation. But the point I want to make is that, somebody trying to say to you that, subluxation either doesn't exist or that it's not defined well, doesn't mean that you have to defend it and say, no, it's wonderfully defined. Subluxation exists. Got it all figured out. Yep. You can just acknowledge, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, this is something we're working on. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean that what we're doing is having an effect. We're working on it. Again, you can still be a great chiropractor and you can still help people and in your head understanding this. Now, I think that maybe the part we'll leave on, Crecio, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, does that concept, so now we talked about what is true, is that going to eat away at a practitioner's certainty because we're not clear on what that process is 100%, and is that going to affect what we're doing day to day in our clinical practice?
I would hate to play people's psychologist. So the answer is, I don't know. It's not going to affect me. I think knowing the truth and being able to communicate the truth and having confidence in what you know that's the best, right? I mean, you can't make up facts and you can't, disprove things that don't exist. Like that's not how reason, that's not how the mind works. We know what we know. We know that we can help somebody, at least I do. And that's how I'm going to continue forward. And again, it all comes down to certainty, right? So if you're not certain, if this is kind of one of those things, I think you need to start looking at some scientific journals because there's a lot of cool stuff on chiropractic. So get certain.
Yeah. A lot of interesting stuff today, Crecio. I know these are thoughts that go through not just young and new chiropractors' minds, but they go through people who've been in the trenches for a long, long time. And there's a reason we get defensive. I think some of it does come down to certainty. If you are uncertain and you're not clear on what you're doing, it's easy to get defensive because those types of thoughts, especially talking about subluxation, really make us feel the pain of what it is we're uncertain about. And it brings up those, you're digging in, you're pushing in the knife. So, the solution is to go through these thought processes, to ask yourself these questions, to try and solve these issues in your head. As we said, today's episode is not something you need to be posting on Facebook. It's not something you need to reply to this woman about unless you really want to. It's not something that necessarily has to go anywhere other than in your mind, but you have to go through and have these thought processes and clear them up in your mind. So when you're in that room or at the table with that person or having a conversation on day one or in review results, you're 1,000% clear on what it is you're doing. So go to the show notes, guys. I'll make sure I put the link to the article in there if you'd like to read it. lifebydesign4chiropractors.com/podcast. And thank you for listening to Life by Design, the voice of reason in chiropractic.